What's up, Pre-Calc Nation? This is our first video for Chapter 9, Day 1. What we're going to be talking about are the angle addition formulas for sine and cosine. So first, just a quick discovery here. The cosine of pi over 6, as you know, pi over 6, cosine is x, sine is y. So that cosine of pi over 6 is root 3 over 2. So let's write that down. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. So then the final answer to this cosine pi over 6 to cosine pi over 3 is root 3 plus 1 all over 2. Now, look over here, okay? A lot of people think, without knowing, that this equals cosine of pi over 6 plus cosine pi over 3. All right? But, as you know, we have to do parentheses first. So when we simplify the inside there, you're going to get cosine of pi over 6 plus pi over 3. So that's going to be 3 pi over 6. Because you would multiply the root pi over 3 by 2 over 2. Well, that's cosine of pi over 2. And clearly, the cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So here's the deal. This is not true. You cannot distribute the cosine. So what we have here are the angle addition formulas. So let's check to see. Right here is the one we were doing. We were doing cosine pi over 6 plus pi over 3. According to our rules, it's cosine s cosine t minus sine s sine t. Okay, so let's verify to see if that works. So we're going to go cosine of pi over 6 plus pi over 3. According to this should be cosine of pi over 6 times cosine pi over 3 minus sine pi over 6 times sine pi over 3. Well, cosine pi over 6, we know, is root 3 over 2. Cosine of pi over 3 is 1/2. Minus sine of pi over 6 is 1/2 times sine of pi over 3 is root 3 over 2. Do you see that we get 0? Check, check, check. So the formulas work. So let's talk about the formulas. If I want to add two angles and take the sine of the sum of the angles, that ends up being sine s cosine t plus cosine s sine t. Notice that the pattern for subtraction follows the same sine, cos, sine, but the sign changes to a negative. The cosine of s plus t, we just found out, is cosine s cosine t minus sine s sine t. And then if I want to subtract, notice I change it to a plus. So these addition formulas in sine, for sine and cosine, you're obviously going to have access to while you're doing your work. So you will end up memorizing it because you're going to be doing it so much, but the formulas will be given to you. All right, so now let's jump into some examples here. So the first one here, you kind of got to look at it and you'd be like, well, you know, we're not adding two angles here. No, this looks like the right side of our formulas, right? So which one of these are we going to look at? Well, we're going to look at this one right here. Okay, I know that I have cosine s, cosine t right here and here. And then I have plus sine s, sine t right here. So that means that this could be my s and this can be my t, s, t. And then if you notice, I should just write it like that. So this ends up being cosine of 2 theta minus theta. And then, yes, you got like terms in there, so this ends up just being cosine theta. Example 2. All right, so this can be my s, this can be my t. So then, since I'm doing cosine theta minus pi, we can write this as cosine theta cosine pi plus sine theta sine pi. Now, the only thing we don't know is what theta is. However, we have pi. We got pi, sine of pi, and cosine of pi, but we don't know theta. So let's see what happens here. We know that when you draw your coordinate, and I go to here, this is the point, -1, 0. So the cosine of pi is -1. So this turns into cosine theta times -1 plus sine of theta times 0. So this cancels. So the answer to this example is negative cosine theta. All right, on to example 3. You could see that I just brought these formulas down because you can obviously have them right next to you when we're doing e-learning. All right, so let's check out part A. All right, so cosine of pi over 2 minus alpha. I want to prove that it equals sine of alpha. Well, let's use, once again, our subtraction rule for cosine. So this is going to be cosine of pi over 2 cosine of alpha plus sine of pi over 2 sine alpha. Well, guys, we know cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So this cancels. Sine of pi over 2 is equal to 1. And I just proved it. So, like we would do in class, what I would recommend is that you pause the video and you try part B on your own. All right, so let's do part B. Did you prove it? Sine of pi over 2 minus beta, does that equal cosine beta? That's what we want to find out. Well, according to our sine rule, when we're subtracting two angles, this equals sine of pi over 2 cosine beta minus cosine pi over 2 sine beta. Well, sine of pi over 2 is 1, so this is just cosine beta. And cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So once again, that cancels. And then notice that we get 0 here. And I end up getting cosine beta. So another check mark. All right, for our next example, we're going to use the formula for cosine s minus t to find the exact value of cosine of 15 degrees. And we've never done that before. Well, here's the deal. We can write cosine of 15 degrees. You got to get a little creative here because you guys are really good at 0, 30, 45, 60, 90, and around the circle we go. So this can be equal to cosine of 45 minus 30. So now I'm going to use my formula for cosine of s minus t. So this equals cosine 45 cosine 30 plus sine 45 sine 30. All right, so why don't you hit pause from here and try to finish up the algebra and the arithmetic going forward. So hit pause and then I'll do the problem. All right, so cosine of 45 is root 2 over 2. The cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2. Plus the sine of 45 is root 2 over 2 times the sine of 30, which is 1/2. Simplifying, when you multiply these roots, you can just write that as root 2 times 3, which is the square root of 6 over 4, plus the square root of 2 over 4. So then the final answer is the square root of 6 plus the square root of 2 all over 4. All right, so we are finished with day 1. So please practice the day 1 problems. Contact your teachers with any questions. We are here to help you. Sorry if you heard Peppa Pig in the background, but that's been going on. So we're going to just have to adapt. But hopefully this was a video that helps you out. And just email me with questions and email your teacher. Thank you.